Welcome to the podcast, Tis But a Scratch, fact and fiction about the Middle Ages. I'm your host, Professor Richard Abels, and today we're going to be talking once again about adultery in the Middle Ages with my very special guest, Professor Larissa Kat Tracy. Kat, it's great to have you back. Last time we talked about Lancelot and Guinevere, and today we're going to be talking about Tristan and Iseult.
It's a delight to be back. Thank you for having me for part 2 of Adultery in the Middle Ages.
So, I wanted to start off with a story. It's a story that may be historical. At least it's asserted to be historical by a number of English chroniclers from the late 12th and early 13th century. And if it is historical, it tells us about what a household knight like Lancelot would have expected if he actually did have a sexual affair with the lady of his lord. The story involves one of the most important and wealthiest of the great nobles of France in the 12th century, later half of the 12th century, and that was Philip of Alsace, who was the Count of Flanders. Philip was well known as being one of the patrons of chivalry. He was a crusader, and in fact, he died in crusade in 1191.
As you do.
And he also had a rather bad reputation in the court of King Henry II of England because he supported the revolt of Henry's eldest son, Henry the Young King, back in 1173 and 1174. So the story that we get, and we get this in the works of two late 12th century English chroniclers, Roger of Howden and Ralph de Decato, both of whom were associated with the court of Henry II, is that in 1175, Philip Count of Flanders accused Walter des Fontaines of having a sexual relationship with the Countess. Walter, a knight of noble birth, who excelled his companions in the pursuit of arms, denied the accusation and offered to purge himself by any means, asserting that he never had relations with the Countess, nor ever even thought of doing so. But the Count refused to accept his purgation, and in a fury ordered him seized and turned over to the household butchers to be beaten within an inch of his life. He was kept alive so that the coup de grace would be that he would be hung head down in a latrine until he suffocated to death. According to the English chronicles, this was followed almost immediately by a very, very upset eldest son of the late Walter, who engineered a revolt against Philip, which seemed in the English court to be just simply karma, since Philip had encouraged the revolt against Henry II.
Right.
As I said, this was my go-to story to contrast adultery in 12th and 13th century romances with adultery in real life. What made it particularly attractive is that Count Philip was one of the great patrons of chivalry of the late 12th century. He was not only an avid participant in tournaments and a crusader, but he also employed the services of courtly poets, among whom was Chrétien de Troyes, the man who gave us the story of Lancelot and Guinevere. It seems so perfect that the patron of the man who invented the story of the great adultery between Lancelot and Guinevere, when encountering a similar situation of his own, would respond by, well, the way he responded. It emphasized the difference between literature and reality.
Right.
Unfortunately, I have since learned that this story may not be actually historical. It may be as fictional as those of Lancelot and Tristan. When I was doing research for this podcast series, I came across an article about Elizabeth of Vermandois written by my good friend, Dr. Heather Tanner. Heather rejected the story's veracity and argued that Elizabeth's concession of her county to her husband was not a penalty for adultery, but a matter of 12th century marital politics. Elizabeth would not have been unique in fighting a husband for control over an inheritance. Heather's rejection of the story of Elizabeth's adultery was based upon the research of another historian, Dr. Ruth Harvey. Dr. Harvey, in an article entitled Cross-Channel Gossip in the 12th Century, pointed out a number of inconsistencies in Roger of Howden's and Ralph de Decato's accounts. The only Walter Desfontaines who appears in Flemish sources died peacefully in a monastery after taking vows in 1182. Although Jacques de Venne did revolt against Count Philip in 1176, the point of contention was control over castles. In fact, none of the contemporary Flemish sources mention or allude to an accusation of adultery against the Countess. One does say that Elizabeth died after a life marked by tribulations, but this could well refer to her husband's insistence upon taking control over her inheritance. On the other hand, there may have been more than one Walter Desfontaines in Flanders in the late 12th century, one who died in a monastery in 1182 and another who died in a much more gruesome fashion in 1175. And the absence of allusions to a court scandal by Flemish chroniclers is not all that surprising. It may be explained by prudence. In short, the story may or may not be true. What I find interesting, though, is that clerics in the court of King Henry II of England found it credible enough and sufficiently salacious to include in their chronicles. Dr. Harvey suggests, as the title of her article indicates, that this was a matter of cross-channel gossip. She also points out that such gossip was rife in Henry II's court and those of his contemporaries. And gossip about the marital problems of Count Philip of Flanders would have been especially welcome in the court of Henry II. The idea that he acquired Vermandois from his wife because of infidelity would cast a shadow of shame over it. Harvey's conclusion is worth quoting. Quote, "The really interesting aspect is perhaps not whether such infidelities actually happened, but the magnet-like attraction the notion of the adulterous queen had for contemporaries, poets, and clerics alike. Thanks to gossip, it could be pressed into service to give a spicy and undemanding gloss to complicated political tussles involving women." End quote. So my once go-to story may be no more than court gossip, the type of celebrity gossip that nowadays gets published in the National Enquirer.
Well, and like a lot of other medieval literature where you've got gruesome punishments, the question is it a literary motif? And how much does art imitate life? And how much does life imitate art? And
in this case, there is things here in common with something like the Song of Roland, being turned over to the kitchen staff to be beaten. And there is something in common with the story of William Marshall being accused of adultery with the Princess Margaret, wife of his lord, the young King Henry, and being refused the right to prove his innocence by trial by combat and forced instead to go into exile. Well, at least he didn't end up suffocating in a latrine. But some historians have cast doubt upon the story that William Marshall was actually accused of adultery with the Princess Margaret, largely because it echoes so closely Tristan's offer to acquit himself of the accusation of adultery through trial by combat, and the unwillingness of anyone in Mark's court to take up the challenge. In theory, trials by combat are decided by God, and God gives victory to the innocent. But in the case of both William Marshall and Tristan, everyone in court knows that they are the best knights, and they will win any trial by combat. Here again, we don't know whether life is imitating art or art is imitating life. And it does seem to be the sort of snarkiness that you get in the court of Henry II with his clerical courtiers like Walter Map, and the way they looked askance at the secular courtiers and aristocratic society.
Of course, especially in the wake of Thomas Becket's promotion to archbishop the day after being ordained a priest.
Yes.
And then his murder in 1170, when he basically did what he told Henry he would do, and that was follow the church. So in the late 1170s, there's no love lost between Henry and clerics, and the secular power of the Angevin court was very daunting to the church.
I'm glad that you're defending Becket, since he was murdered by one of your ancestors.
That's true, William de Tracy. That is so not my fault, but yes.
Yeah, right,
indeed.
Sure. The sin of the great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather.
Right, that is how the Tracys end up in Ireland,
yes.
Exiled for their part in the murder, yes.
The thing that I would say about this, and the first time I had encountered the story was in an essay by John Benton called Clio and Venus, in which he was trying to dismantle the myth of courtly love, a myth which is so ingrained in at least the late 19th and early 20th century medieval literature. C.S. Lewis.
We have C.S. Lewis to thank for that. Yeah. And at 25, he decided that he had the ultimate corner the market on love with the allegory of love. And the problem is that he based that on reading Andres Capellanes seriously. And he didn't see it as satire. He saw it as an actual thing and developed this idea that was almost a cult of courtly love in early 20th century scholarship.
Exactly. And we don't even have a term, courtly love.
No.
The term we have is fine loving.
Yes, fin amour, or finement vinga in Middle English, in Chaucer, which Chaucer mocks relentlessly in A Knight's Tale and in several of the Canterbury Tales. There is this sense that courtly love is unrealistic. It's ridiculous to assume that people would love each other to the death, especially if they've never even spoken to one another.
Exactly. Now, I've had a tremendous sympathy for John Benton's argument because I think it's right. There is a difference between literature and reality.
Of course.
In this case, however, the story, which is a lurid story, is just over the top.
Yes.
And I think that what makes it interesting to me for this particular podcast is that it would be believed.
Right.
The idea that a household knight who had the temerity to have sex with his lord's wife, that this is what should happen to him.
Right. And this idea that courtly love promotes adultery to start with is because courtly love only operates where you have a knight who's of lower birth or a lover of lower birth in love with a lady of higher status. And she's invariably married to somebody else. So if you take courtly love at face value, it has to be adulterous. But then there are consequences to that.
And adultery cannot be ignored on the political level of someone like the Count of Flanders.
Of course not.
We're talking about succession in terms of land and lineage.
Right. And in a world of primogeniture where you are now inheriting based on your bloodline, you have to prove that the children that are born are actually of that same bloodline.
But all of this makes it extremely interesting to me that the two most famous stories from medieval literature are both about adultery.
And in fact, they're very similar to each other in that regard.
We've already talked about Lancelot and Guinevere.
Yes, we have.
Yes, we have.
Yes, we have.
So let's talk about Tristan and Iseult, or Isolde, or
Iseult. Yes.
Iseult.
Yes.
Whereas the Lancelot and Guinevere story gave birth to a very good musical, Camelot, the Tristan legend is the basis for one of the great operas, Richard Wagner's Tristan und Isolde. And this is the Liebestod conducted by Arturo Toscanini. We'll talk about Richard Wagner's Tristan und Iseult in the third episode of the series, in which Kat and I will review medieval adultery as portrayed in modern literature and movies. But let's now turn to the medieval story of Tristan and Iseult. So, I would like to start with you basically telling our listeners what the medieval story was. And we do have sort of a recreation of the original story from the year 1900.
Yes. Joseph Bédier's collection from 1900, he takes together a bunch of the different medieval sources from Thomas of Britain, from Beroll, from Gottfried, and one other German author, and he...
Eilhard,
yes. And he creates this composite story that becomes the standard staple for modern popular culture. But the story of Tristan and Iseult, Beroll is associated with the earliest version in the 12th century. He's kind of given credit for that.
About 1160, 1170.
Something along those lines. Chrétien de Troyes supposedly claims credit for the story of Tristan and Iseult, but we don't actually have that version.
Well, at least he has credit for Lancelot.
Exactly. And I mean, I think that's probably... he's responsible for enough in that regard.
Yeah.
But because by the 1170s, Marie de France writes Chèvrefolt, that is about Tristan and Iseult,
yes,
and assumes that the story is well known enough that she doesn't have to give all the full details, because Chèvrefolt's very short as a Breton lay. That story must have been deeply embedded in the popular awareness and popular culture. So the first story that comes out of the late 12th century is a story of Tristan, who is the nephew of King Mark of Cornwall. And his mother was Mark's beloved sister, and his father was honorable and noble, falls in love with Mark's sister, and... Yes, and when he discovers that his own land has been beset by the evil Morgan, which is a man, in this case, not Morgan Le Fay, who attacks Leonas. He takes his wife, Blanchefleur, back, and she is left pregnant when her husband dies.
Oh, that's so sad.
It's terribly sad, because, of course, you have to have a product of that sadness who goes on to create even more sadness. This is Tristan. This is why he's named Tristan. And in fact, the idea that the circumstances of his birth, because his mother dies of grief within minutes of giving birth to this son, and he's named Tristan because of the sadness that surrounds the inception of his life, poor kid. I mean, you're saddling him with that name, and you're basically saying, hi, your life is going to suck. He is, however, a clever child, and he is taken in by a steward who raises him and who instructs him in all of the courtly skills. He is a harper. He knows how to kill deer. He is a skilled hunter and bozeman.
He knows how to dress the deer.
He does.
Yes.
And he knows how to show King Mark's men how to dress those deer.
Yeah.
And Bédier goes into this beginning story for Tristan and has Tristan show up in Cornwall at where he schools King Mark's men in how to dress a deer.
And what we have over here, because Bédier is pulling things together,
yes,
is that there are two basic fonts for the story. There is a font which is called the common or the primitive Tristan. And that's Beroll and this guy, Eilhard, this German. And in that, you have fewer references to courtliness.
Right.
You have the basic story.
Right.
And then what you have is the Thomas of Britain,
yes,
which comes to a culmination in Gottfried of Strasbourg in 1210. And that's the courtly, in which courtliness is being...
Yeah, and you also have the prose Tristan that comes out of that. And the prose Tristan of the 13th century starts to work in the Arthurian material. So when you start seeing the appearance of Arthurian characters, that's the 13th century.
Okay, let me ask
Tristan.
you this. How does Arthur get into this? Because because this story doesn't have anything to do with Arthur.
Not at all. And it's actually, they're only just brief references, but you get different knights of Arthur's court who show up. Yvain.
Yvain, yeah.
Yvain.
Yeah.
And without his lion. And Yvain shows up.
Of course he has to be without his lion.
Because the lion
would have recognized adulterers and would have attacked them.
And eaten them both.
Yeah, they're sermons.
And they would have deserved it in that context. The Arthurian story, though, just becomes a touch point for the story of Tristan and Isolde, because none of it takes place in Arthur's court.
It's sort of like a black hole with a gravitational pull.
A small moon.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
And what happens is the dynamic about adultery in Lancelot and Guinevere's story mirrors that of Tristan and Isolde.
They're similar, but there's going to be a critical difference, right?
Yes.
And that's
they both die.
Well, they have also the potion.
Yes. And the potion occurs in all of the versions, but the potion is this love spell. It is a potion designed to inspire love, supposedly between Isolde and Mark, prepared for her by her mother or her maid, depending on the version.
Yeah.
And, of course, Love Spell spurns the title of the 1981 version of the film.
Terrible movie.
Terrible movie that we'll talk about
with Richard
soon.
Burton. Terrible film.
Terrible film. And Nicholas Clay, who had just come off of playing Lancelot in Excalibur.
Yeah, and multiple adulterer.
I think that the director probably saw him in Excalibur and said, yes, that's my Tristan? I don't understand that. He can't act in either one of them, and at least in Excalibur, he has shiny, shiny armor. But in the story of Tristan and Isolde, the potion becomes the catalyst for their adultery.
So we're back with Tristan. Tristan he's been born in sadness. He's been raised to be perfectly courtly. What happens to him as a child? How do we get to Isolde?
He ends up going to King Mark's kingdom, to Cornwall, and King Mark is so impressed with him without realizing first that it's his nephew. And when he does realize that, yes, this is his nephew, he takes him in. Mark loves him like a son, treats him like a son.
And it's important that Mark doesn't have any living sons.
And in fact, he has resisted marrying. Very specifically, he has resisted marrying because he wants to make Tristan his heir. And because he knows that Tristan is his bloodline and any son that he has will displace Tristan. So he specifically does not marry so that Tristan can become his heir. However, his barons push him, and it makes sense that they would. They want the heir of their king's body to take the throne. And so two birds alight one day with a strand of golden hair. Now, before this, of course, Mark's been resisting marriage. There is this dynamic between Ireland and Cornwall.
Oh.
And King Mark has resisted the requirement that the Irish king has placed upon all the kings of Cornwall before him. And the requirement is that 1 year they have to pay £300 in copper. The next year they have to pay £300 in silver. The next year £300 in gold. And then a year after that, they have to provide men and women who will be essentially condemned to servitude as serfs and send over their best and brightest over to Ireland. And Mark refuses to do this. The Irish threaten to attack and invade, and they send their champion, Morholt, who's essentially a giant and very noted for beheading people, by the way, which is an interesting allusion to some of the beheading contests in the Arthurian tradition. And Tristan says, I will fight the Morholt. And he fights this battle on an island. Nobody witnesses the battle.
Right.
But Tristan kills the Morholt with his sword, leaving a sliver in his brain, and takes his somewhat scarred and broken sword back with him. Everybody thinks that he's been killed because he takes the Morholt's boat with him. And in fact, boats become very important in the Tristan and Isolde story.
And Morholt's sword has been poisoned so that Tristan, although he's only slightly wounded, nonetheless, is gravely ill.
Yes. And when he comes back with both swords, he knows that he's dying, and he puts himself into a boat, as you do, and kind of sets himself adrift with his harp, and he comes to Ireland, as you do.
As you do.
And it is Isolde who finds him in his boat. And Isolde, of course, is well aware that Tristan of Lyonesse is the one who has killed Morholt, and she thinks he's a murderer.
And Morholt is her uncle.
Yes. And she has sworn vengeance against Tristan. She hates Tristan, the very thought of him. But here comes this beautiful man, and she heals him without immediately recognizing who he is.
And she doesn't tell him who
who she is either.
Yes.
So there's a lot of secrecy that goes on in this. And in tending him, she falls in love with him.
And what he does is he instructs her. He calls himself Tantris, which is a really clever way of hiding his identity.
Yes, because
nobody would ever figure out anagrams back then.
No, not at all. And what happens, he goes back to Cornwall, and then Mark is told he has to marry. The birds bring this golden strand of hair, just as you do, random birds. You think about the swallows migrating with coconuts and this one, carrying on a line. And Mark says, okay, I'll marry the woman to whom this hair belongs. And Mark does that thinking they'll never find her, that no one's ever going to be able to figure this out. So he thinks he's getting out of that in need to marry.
But Tristan
recognizes it.
Yes. And
Tristan's like, oh, I know who has hair like this. So he says to Mark, I will go fetch this woman for you. I don't think he realizes that Mark really was trying to get out of marriage, but...
No, but Tristan has a problem. Although it sounds really great to be the heir apparent to the throne, he realizes that he has aroused the envy and jealousy of all of his fellow...
Everybody.
He's
too amazing.
He is... And it's one of the wonderful things about at least Gottfried von Strasbourg's version of this, is that it shows you this jealousy that's within the court and how a knight needs to excel, needs to prove himself better than everybody else, but also needs to do so in a way that doesn't arouse the envy and the hatred of everyone else. When Tristan first arrives in Mark's court, and he's in disguise, he's not going to announce, I am Mark's nephew.
Right.
He's just some lost boy who had stumbled onto Mark's hunt. Tristan is being cautious by concealing his identity, which is prudent given how he arrived in Mark's court. He had been kidnapped by Norwegian traders who were impressed with his skill at playing chess and saw him as a valuable commodity. But as soon as the merchants set sail with their prize, their vessel was immediately buffeted by winds that blew it to the shores of Cornwall, which the merchants, understandably, took to be a sign of God's displeasure for their treachery to the boy. So when the wind slackened, they put him ashore and wished him luck. The young Tristan establishes a place in Mark's court by demonstrating his abilities and his talents. In doing so, Gottfried provides a catalog of the non-military skills expected of the perfect courtier, and these include the ability to play musical instruments, to sing, and to know various languages. In fact, those skills of the medieval courtier are not that much different from the skills of the Renaissance courtier. So Gottfried relates how Tristan walks in after supper on King Mark being entertained by a professional harper, who, as Gottfried tells us, was a master of his art. Tristan listens, then compliments the musician, praising him, quote, "You produce your notes correctly and with the sad passion they were meant to have," end quote. Then Tristan identifies the Breton lay that the harper had sung. The minstrel, impressed by Tristan's knowledge, asks the boy, and we are told that Tristan at the time is only 14 years old, whether he is versed in the musical arts. Tristan responds, quote, "There was a time when I too had mastered it, but my skill is now so feeble that I dare not play in your hearing," end quote. I used to be able to, but...
I'm not sure.
And here, try. He takes a hold of it, and he plays it more beautifully than anybody has ever heard before.
As though the strings were an extension of his own finger.
And of course, not only does he play with consummate virtuosity, but he sings lays in Breton, Welsh, correct Latin, and French. Again, when pressed by Mark about his knowledge of languages, he responds to the other courtiers in Danish, Norwegian, German, and Scots. And then they give him another instrument. No, I can't do that. And again,
more beautiful than the angels of heaven.
The whole point is that you never claim to be better than anyone else. You demonstrate it, and then you use self-deprecating language,
right,
to say, no, this is this was all by luck. This is all by chance.
Rather like Gawain and Sir Gawain the Green Knight.
Yes.
He says, I am the least of everybody. Nobody will miss me. I'm the king's nephew and his best knight ever. But no, I'm really not.
But the point is, you're showing yourself to be better than
right.
and they know it.
And the humility is important. Because if you're boastful, then you deserve whatever happens to you.
You know, what always reminded me of is the college quarterback who has just had the most remarkable game. He's thrown for 5 touchdowns. He's gone 450 yards, and he's being interviewed at the end of the game. And he says, I owe it all to God and my faith and to that great linemen who have protected me. Right. And then he credits all, but and I imagine what would happen if he said what he really felt.
It's like, I
even amaze myself. And if they gave me a decent line and some running backs and some receivers could actually catch, I'd show you something.
Right.
Because the next game, he'd be on his ass.
That's right. And of course, you basically end up with Tom Brady. Or Aaron Rodgers, same way.
So the whole game of courtliness is to show that you're superior without
acting it.
Without acting it.
It's humility is necessary.
It's measure.
Right. And that idea of Tristan's prowess is what identifies him to Mark. Because Mark can see through the disguise. They all can see, obviously, he is.
And you get that in fairy tales.
You do.
Where it's by seeing the quality of the individual. That person may have been raised by these 2 farmers, but you know that this was actually the orphan son of the king.
Right.
Because of that nobility that you can just see.
And that's innate. That's something that's innate. It's a quality that they're born with. It's like in Havelock the Dane, he is raised when his evil uncle kills his family, slits his sister's throat, and wants him cast into the sea. But the fisherman Grimm raises him. Well, everybody knows his nobility because when he falls asleep, a light emanates from his mouth and he has a birthmark that glows.
Yvain could be a wild man. He could have a scraggly beard. He could be naked. He could be dirty. But you take one look at him.
And you know.
And you know this is nobility.
And this is what happens with Tristan. And even in the moments where both Lancelot and Tristan in their various stories go quote unquote mad, and in their madness seem to be unrecognizable, they are recognized because of their innate quality.
After Tristan has established himself at Mark's court through his abilities and has come of age to be knighted, Mark finally learns who the boy actually is. For 3.5 years, Tristan's foster father, Rohat or Roald the Trustworthy, each version of the story has slightly different names, has been searching for the kidnapped boy. He finally discovers him at Mark's court at Tintagel. Questioned by Mark, Rohat explains that Tristan is the orphan son of Rivlin and Mark's sister Blanchefleur. Overjoyed, Mark embraces Tristan and recognizes him as his nephew and presumptive heir. Mark's barons and the other household knights admire Tristan and respect his abilities, but they also come to envy him. So we have Tristan in this court knowing that everybody is jealous of him, everybody is envious, and that he's a target.
Yes.
He needs to be able to demonstrate that he has the interest of his uncle at heart rather than his own.
So, right. And this becomes very important in going to win this woman that, again, Mark thinks he's setting an impossible task because he doesn't want to get married. But when Tristan says, I know who this is, he goes to Ireland and discovers that there's a dragon.
Of course there's a dragon.
There's a dragon that devours maidens and needs to be fought and killed. And whomever kills this dragon is going to win the hand of Iseult the Fair. I mean, she's the prize.
And the dragon has been eating pretty well of wannabes.
Absolutely, because all of the knights who've tried have been devoured. And so, of course, Tristan fights this magnificent beast that is part griffin, part serpent, described in these fascinating bestiary terms. And he kills the dragon. And he cuts out the dragon's tongue. But the venom of the dragon's tongue makes him pass out. He sticks it in his boot, and when it touches his skin, he's knocked out immediately. So his horse is dead. He's somewhere off to the side, and, well, there's the seneschal. Again, with these seneschals like Kay in the Arthurian tradition, who are really honestly dicks.
Yeah.
You gotta wonder why it is that all the seneschals are so foul-tempered and just nasty in general.
Because they're the vice principals.
That's true. They don't have the authority or the impressive.
They're the archdeacons. They're the ones. They're the ones who go ahead and discipline young knights and they're the ones who are standing between the young knight and the rewards that they're going to get from the Lord. No one likes a seneschal.
They're the third sons.
And if you're going to be writing a poem to entertain the household knights of some baron, then the surest way of doing it is
to make fun of the seneschal. Absolutely. And in this case, the seneschal is a coward, and he is a liar, and he is a felon, and he comes upon the dragon dead. And they don't see any sign of the other knight. They see the horse that's dead. They don't see the slayer of the dragon. And so the seneschal takes it upon himself to cut off the dragon's head and take it back as a trophy to claim Iseult for himself. And Iseult is kind of like, no, I don't like this idea. So she investigates herself. She goes to where the dragon is. She sees that the hoof prints are of a horse not shod in Ireland. She sees that the horse has a saddle and bridle not native to Ireland. And then they find Tristan. And he's out cold, but he's alive. And she picks him up there, or she gets him carried home, where her mother treats him.
And her mother is also named Iseult. We're going to have a wealth of Iseults in this.
We are. And, I mean, there's a whole contingent of poor Irish women named Iseult as well. And it's kind of like naming your daughter Juliet. Do you really want to name them after such a tragic character? But in this instance, the Queen of Ireland does not want her daughter to be forced to marry the seneschal either.
Yeah.
And so she is more than happy to tend this knight. And when they lift him, the tongue falls out of the boot and he revives. And he needs to be nursed back to health because of the poison. And when he eventually is able to go to the king and say, here's the tongue, I killed the dragon first, the king, of course, has to relent and has to go back on it. Now, before this, Isolde has figured out who Tristan is. And she says to him, you're Tristan of Lyonesse. You killed Morholt. That was murder.
Because when tenting for him, what she's discovered is that his sword has a notch in it.
And she again investigates. This is a very inquisitive woman. And she takes the sword to the skull of Morholt that she's preserved, as you do. And she compares the actual wound on the skull and the missing fragment of his sword. Splinter. And the splinter. And she confronts Tristan. And Tristan's like, hold on. Yes, I am Tristan of Lyonesse. But you know what? I killed Morholt fair and square. That was not murder. That was combat. That was honorable. And you know what? I saved your life. You've saved my life now twice, because I was the one in the boat with the harp. And he said, but I've now slain the dragon. So we kind of owe each other here.
And if you turn me in, you're going to have to marry the seneschal.
That guy. And you don't want to do that. So, I mean, this could be beneficial to both of us. And she realizes that. She goes to her father and she makes her father promise, this nice open-ended promise that we know is never a good idea, but in this case it is. And she makes her father promise to grant this knight pardon no matter what. He does. And she makes him have the kiss of peace, exchange that. And so he pardons Tristan, and everyone's like, hey, wait a minute. That's the guy who killed Morholt. Damn it. And the king is like, Oh, well,
Well,
I mean, and I did agree. And so Iseult thinks she's going to marry Tristan. But he's there to fetch her for Mark. And actually, Bédier in his compilation makes this very clear. Tristan's tricked her and guiled her into this marriage. She thinks she's going to marry Tristan, but she's not. And she's actually displeased with the fact that she's going to be given to somebody else. Now, in the variations of this story, the journey from Ireland back to Cornwall, it is on ship that potion comes into play.
Yes.
And the potion is either made by Iseult's mother or her maid, or in some cases herself. Now, the potion is meant to be a binding love potion that, will bring love to two people.
In the primitive stories, in the story that Berulle tells, it's going to last for 3 years.
Yes.
And in the story that the German Eilhart tells, it's going to last for 4 years. But in the courtly strand,
Thomas of Britain, it's
going forever.
Forever. And when the potion is administered, and I say that in passive tense on purpose, because, again, there's some suggestion that it's an accident, that they accidentally drink this potion, the two of them, no culpability whatsoever. Other variations, Iseult actually gives it to Tristan on purpose because she wants to bind him to her because she doesn't really want to marry Mark.
Well, she doesn't know Mark.
No, of course not. Unless, of course, you're watching the film versions that we'll talk about later.
Yeah.
But this idea of the Irish princess fetched by the best knight of a king and brought over as a marriage prize is actually an echo of the Arthurian tradition too, because in some Arthurian versions, Guinevere is, as the daughter of King Leodegrance, is Irish. And it's Lancelot who goes to fetch her for Arthur. Yeah. And then they fall in love on that journey. With Tristan and Isolde, it's the same idea, but it's a potion. And the potion allows a certain amount of plausible deniability.
A lot of deniability. It's also interesting that the potion is concocted not by some witch in the woods.
Right.
But it's either by the Queen Mother or by the princess herself. There's something magical about women in these romances.
Yes.
Often they're capable of mixing up potions that are either love potions or potions to restore the sanity of these knights who've gone mad.
Happens a lot, apparently.
As in Yvain, or poison.
Right. And part of it is this assumption that certain magic and certain potions are a product of women's work or women's knowledge, but also the association of these potions with Ireland. That idea of kind of the magical West that you see in the otherworldly tradition. And of course, Ireland was untouched by the Romans, and the Romans never actually managed to conquer it. Some suggestion that they traded back and forth, because of course they did. And the Irish did certainly raid into Wales and, kidnap and enslave people like Patrick. But there's always this association of Ireland with the West and magic and kind of the ancient beliefs. So when you have two Irish queens and princesses, queen and a princess, the idea that they would have that magical knowledge makes perfect sense.
Yes.
And it's women's magic. And there's no Merlin in these stories. The magic happens through the women.
It happens through the women. And it reminds us that what we're having are stories written by men about women.
Yes.
And written for audiences that are largely male audiences. Occasionally you may have a female, the lady may be a patron.
Though I think in a lot of the courtly milieu of Eleanor of Aquitaine that changed, because you have a lot of mixed audiences. And of course, a counterpart to Chrétienne and Berulle is Marie de France.
Yes.
Who incorporates the Tristan story as chèvre folle.
The medieval clergy's conception of women, which draws heavily upon Aristotle, at least it does for the scholastics like Thomas Aquinas, is that women are by nature more emotional, less rational, and more sexual than men are. I'm curious how this matches up with the conception of women as it appears in medieval romances.
I'm not sure I would agree that that's the case in a lot of medieval literature, though. I think that there are plenty of men who are emotional.
Well, in terms of love, not even
just love, but you have a lot of male knights who, especially over each other, I mean, the grief.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. They swoon.
They cry. They tear their hair. The fact that Lancelot and Tristan both go mad. I mean, you don't really see a lot of female characters going mad to that extent.
It's funny because you're right. You're absolutely right about that. And in terms of the love romances, it's the men who seem to lose themselves. They're the ones who go mad. They're the ones who can't control the love. Whereas the objects of their love, although they do love the heroes, they do it in a much more measured and much more pragmatic way.
Yes, and consider that it's Iseult who investigates about the dragon. She goes on her own steam. She has a lot of agency in these stories. And if you consider some of the female models of the time, I mean, Eleanor of Aquitaine and Marie de Champagne and Adèle of Blois, these are women who had to control their lands when their men were off on crusade. Adèle of Blois runs her entire household and all of her husband's lands while he's off, faffing about in the Middle East. So this idea of feminine emotion and irrationality is largely a modern misconception, I would think.
Or also a clerical.
That too.
It appears in canon law, and it appears in people like Thomas Aquinas, but that's because they are... Well, for one thing, what they're doing is they're drawing from classical sources.
Right. But they're also, their entire existence is predicated on not being in the contact of women.
Yes.
And the church repeated quite a lot of things because people refused to actually do it. And the church has to keep making a point over and over and over again because people are like, no, we're just not. Because you have plenty of women who are powerful leaders of the church. Hildegard of Bingen. I mean, she's 12th century as well. And she resists a lot of the patriarchal misogyny of the accepted church, but she is operating within the structure of the church. So I think part of our problem in the modern era is we get an image of the Middle Ages through the filter of clerics, who very often were just bitter, nasty, unpleasant individuals themselves.
Are you saying there were incels?
Some of them, yes, absolutely.
The red pill.
And you think about the anger that they direct at women in so many ways. They're drawing from their own assumptions of biblical precedent and they're interpreting the text the way they like to. I mean, Jerome is the one who translates the Bible and he was no fan of women.
Yeah.
So you have to consider the source. And the difference with the romances is that these authors, these poets, had female patrons. I mean, we talked in the last episode about the fact that Marie de Champagne and Eleanor of Aquitaine are patrons. They are the origin point for some of these stories. So to have women like Iseult who are strong, capable, intelligent women is not surprising.
It makes sense. So what we have is our Tristan is now aboard the ship.
Yes.
And either by accident, and mostly in most of the versions, it's an error. Somebody has made a mistake.
Yes.
They both drink the potion.
And they fall madly in love with one another.
And it's uncontrollable.
Totally uncontrollable. And when they get back, of course, she marries Mark.
But here's a problem.
Yes.
She has to be a virgin, and she's not a virgin anymore.
Because that ship ride was a little long, and the boat rocked a little too far, a little too hard.
And they both drank a bit too much.
Yes, they did. They can say that the wine went to their head, as it were.
Yeah, as it were. So, our heroine is confronted with a real problem. She is going to
have to prove her virginity.
How can you do that? How do you do that, I ask you?
Well, there are ways, but of course, this also is predicated on a complete lack of understanding of female anatomy. But, the assumption was the sheets have to be bloody the next morning. Somebody checks. Yes. There are ways to discover this. So you have to fake it. And there are ways to fake it.
But in this case, what you can do is substitute someone.
Yep. And you can put somebody else in her place. And that's what she does with her maid.
Who is probably the best maid that you possibly ever could have. this
She's
this-
so devoted
yeah,
to Iseult.
this woman sacrifices so much to Iseult.
Just for Iseult's sake. And so Mark is convinced of the virginity because he spends the night with Bronwyn.
And they put out all the lights so that
You can't tell.
so you can't
No.
you can't tell.
No.
And Iseult creeps into bed in the morning.
So he wakes up next to her and thinks, ta-da!
Yes.
The marriage has been consummated. Now, and actually that raises another interesting point because the marriage hasn't been consummated. At least not
So
that
the
way.
question is whether it in fact is a legitimate marriage or not.
Right.
Because
Now,
unless you consummate it, it's simply a betrothal. It's
Right.
not yet a full
but
marriage.
the assumption is that they will eventually consummate
Yeah.
the marriage. Because Mark truly loves Isolde. And Isolde comes to love Mark. But she also loves Tristan.
Wow, that sounds familiar. Wait, have I heard this
Funny
before?
enough, I don't know. This idea of two men who love each other but also love a woman in this triangle and everybody loves everyone else. I think it's King Arthur.
No wonder they come together.
Exactly. And I think that's why you start to see the addition of the Arthurian characters is to draw the Tristan and Isolde story into it. And in variations of the Tristan and Isolde story, which has as many variations as the Arthurian tradition
Yes.
does, because you've got the Italian, the German, the Norse,
It becomes such a popular
It
story.
does. And you've got to wonder, why is it that these stories of tragic adultery are so popular in the 12th and 13th century?
So how does our story now become tragic? What we've had so far is a story in which we now have the adulterous relationship.
Yes.
And it's an adulterous relationship between two good people.
Who don't really want to betray her husband.
So we don't have an abusive husband. We don't have somebody who deserves something terrible happening.
He's not even indifferent. He's not even a husband who pays his wife no mind, even though Mark didn't really want to marry in the first place. But it becomes necessary to justify that adultery.
And we have a difficulty because since this is an irresistible passion,
Magic.
it has to be consummated, but it has to be consummated without it becoming public.
Right. And so the affair is conducted in secret. And depending on the version of the story, in some cases they manage to resist and they just love each other and Tristan goes off somewhere else
Yes.
and marries Iseult of the Fair Hands, which,
Because her name is Iseult and she's beautiful. And Thomas of Britain goes into essentially 3 pages of, I would not have married her if she were merely beautiful and her name hadn't been Iseult, and I wouldn't have married her if her name was Iseult, but she wasn't
wasn't
beautiful.
Yeah. And so he marries Iseult of the White Hands as kind of a placeholder, as it were. But it depends on the version, because in
Yes.
some versions they conduct their affair in secret for ages. In others, they separate. It's in Berol where they essentially run off together and they're living in squalor and misery.
Although in Gottfried's courtly version, they're banished by Mark and they live in a crystal cave in pure love with one another. It's an example of the difference between the primitive and the courtly versions of this story.
And Mark finally takes pity on them.
Yes, because Mark comes upon them in the wilderness, and much to his delight, he discovers that they are fully clothed, lying together, and there's a sword between them.
Because that implies that no matter that they're together, that they have maintained a certain chastity.
Yes.
And in that instance, Mark relents. And that's when Tristan is sent off to marry Iseult of the White Hands, and he is eventually wounded. And when he's wounded, in Berol's version, because Mark pities them, he never punishes them.
Yes. Mark, as portrayed in the romances of Berulle, Eilhart, Thomas of Britain, and Gottfried von Strasbourg, is a conflicted character. He is a good king and a good man who loves his wife and his nephew, but is tormented by the suspicion that they are cuckolding him. As king, the possible adultery of his wife is a political as well as a personal offense. If the queen is unfaithful, she has committed treason and deserves to be burnt alive, the same penalty Guinevere faces for her adultery, and Tristan will be executed. Unlike King Arthur, Mark becomes obsessed with proving or disproving the rumors. Jealous of Tristan's position in court, some wicked barons feed Mark's suspicions, and with the aid of a malicious dwarf, they devise traps and spy upon the lovers with the intention of catching them in flagrante delicto.
Because that's how you have to do.
Because legally you need to.
Yes, absolutely.
But time after time, Tristan and Iseult manage to foil the conspirators. Mark cannot obtain the evidence needed to convict the adulterers legally, but he also can't ignore the rumors and gossip that are spreading around his court, or the evidence of Tristan's and Iseult's affection and care for one another. As a result, Mark flips back and forth between suspicion and remorse for doubting his wife and nephew's fidelity. I have a lot of sympathy for Mark. Mark's conundrum is summed up in Gottfried's version by the wise old Bishop of the Thames. Yes, there is a Bishop of the Thames in the German version. The bishop advises the king, quote, "My Lady Isolde and Lord Tristan are suspected of serious transgressions, yet judging by what I have heard, they have not been proved guilty by any sort of evidence. On the other hand, however the matter stands here, whether it be true or not, reports and allegations have been gossiped about in such a point that you have taken offense and the court is scandalized." End quote. These rumors must be put to rest, and the best way of doing that is by legal means. As no one is willing to face Tristan in a trial by combat, the surest proof then is for the queen to undergo an ordeal. Iseult is then summoned by Mark. The Bishop of the Thames tells her something that she's well aware of, that there are rumors about her and Tristan. Though there isn't any hard evidence that she has done anything wrong, and the bishop has no wish to impugn her honor, the king, he tells her, views it with suspicion because the court declares it to be true. Iseult responds accurately but disingenuously by saying that she isn't surprised that there would be such nasty talk about her and that she'd be the victim of such rumors, as she is far from home with no friends and relatives to defend her. But pressed by the bishop, she agrees to undergo the ordeal of the red-hot iron. If she is innocent, she will be able to carry the iron without being burnt. And it doesn't look good for the queen at this point.
And I believe she finds a way around it.
They concoct a clever ruse. Iseult sends word to Tristan to come in disguise to King Arthur's court at Caerleon, where she is to undergo the ordeal. Tristan disguises himself as a leper in Berul's version and as a pilgrim in Gottfried's. No one recognizes him, and when Iseult is about to disembark from the ship that brought her, she calls upon the leper/pilgrim to carry her ashore so as not to muddy her fine clothes. The disguised Tristan does so, but purposely stumbles as they reach shore, ending up between her legs. Iseult, whom Gottfried says prepared for the ordeal with prayers and fasting, then swears upon holy relics that no man has ever had carnal knowledge of her, and no man has been between her legs except for a husband, and as you've seen it, this pilgrim.
And the pilgrim, of course,
is Tristan.
It is the same kind of oath that Guinevere swears in the Chevalier La Charette, where she says, "I swear, I have not had sex with any of the knights in this room." And of course, by then, Lancelot's no longer in the room.
And it's a difficult thing because Gottfried says this is how pliable Christ is.
Right. And that
he's like a windsock.
Technicality. I mean, she's technically not lying.
But the point is she isn't lying.
No, she's not.
And therefore, she would not be exposed because the oath she took
is fair. It's valid.
Fair.
She's not forsworn. And you end up with a lot of those very carefully worded oaths in a lot of these literary sources. But the tragedy comes from the assumption that it's in the 13th century prose version, though, where it takes a deadly turn. And that's where we get kind of the resonance of the story in Dante that we talked about the last time with Paolo and Francesca. Because in the prose version, Mark finds them together and attacks Tristan while Tristan's playing his harp for Isolde and kills him with a poisoned blade. And then Isolde dies.
Which is the version that Alfred Lord Tennyson uses in the last tournament in his Idylls of the King. I'd also add that in the mid-13th century prose Tristan, Mark becomes a really unpleasant character, which he also is in Mallory's version of the story. I think this is an attempt to excuse the lovers. We are running out of time, but fortunately, we're also coming to the end of the Tristan and Iseult story. And the story does end in tragedy with the death of the two lovers, although there's some disagreement about how they died. As Kat pointed out, in the mid-13th century prose Tristan dies at the hands of his uncle Mark, which apparently is the version that Dante was familiar with. But this is not how Tristan dies in the 12th century versions of the story.
Now Thomas of Britain injects some tragedy. So Berulle has them kind of forgiven and they go their separate ways, and the implications, they're still always in love with each other, but they're not ever together. In Thomas of Britain, Tristan is wounded, having married Iseult of the White Hands.
And becomes really close friends with her brother.
Yes, and he is wounded in killing other knights who were a threat and a danger, and he asks his wife Iseult to send for Iseult the Fair to heal him, because Iseult the Fair is known as a healer.
And she's the only one who can heal him from his wound.
Absolutely, because this seems to be a constant with poor Tristan, is that it has to be Iseult who heals him.
So the brother of his wife, his brother-in-law, goes off to Cornwall to find
Iseult the Fair
and bring her back.
Right, and there's going to be a signal, because Tristan, of course, despairing that he won't be able to find her, the signal is the sails of the ship.
Is that from Theseus, the story of Theseus?
It does come from the story of Theseus. The brother-in-law has to find Iseult the Fair, and if he has her and comes back, the sails have to be white.
Yes.
That's the signal.
Because the sail otherwise will be black.
Yes, and the black sail implies that he didn't find her, in which case Tristan will have to die. Well, Iseult, the White Hands, the wifey Iseult, is envious, and she's petty, and she just doesn't want that Iseult in her house.
Can you blame her?
No, but I mean, she's also risking the death of her husband.
She's also really pissed off because apparently, at least in some of the versions, Tristan has never touched her.
Which would make you kind of bitter. But in other versions, they do have children.
Yeah.
And he still prefers the other.
Yeah.
So you end up with this variant story where either he has touched his wife or he has not touched his wife. She's bitter because of the rivalry of a woman she's never met, or she's just bitter because her husband loves her instead. Either way, when she sees the ship and the ship has white sails, she reports to Tristan that it does not, that it has black sails.
Oh.
And he dies heartbroken. Not from his wound, but heartbroken that either Iseult the Fair would not come to him or could not be found to heal him.
But Iseult now comes and finds
the dead Tristan. She shows up just as he dies, or in some cases just as he is dying, and he dies, and then she falls down dead on top of him.
Oh,
move over, I'm
what
dying
you should
next
do
to
is,
you.
And Iseult, in at least some of the stories, the surviving Iseult, wifey's Iseult, decides to keep them separate even in death.
Right.
So, and they plant two trees because it's separate, but the trees grow together.
And they entwine. And of course, the story of Chèvrefour by Marie de France is the story of the honeysuckle, because Chèvrefour means honeysuckle, and the hazel. And she uses that as a metaphor for the two lovers. And in her lay, she only reports one instance where they've been separated for a very long time, and he leaves her a signal of the hazelwood. And as she comes riding out of the castle, she sees it, she knows to stop, and she and Tristan have a momentary interlude together with the implication that after they will go their separate ways. But Marie de France also alludes to the fact that they will die the same day. She doesn't say how. So it's either the sales or it's murder. She doesn't explain. Yeah. But she emphasizes the lasting endurance of their love as a symbiotic relationship where the honeysuckle feeds off the hazelwood, but the hazelwood needs the honeysuckle to stay alive. And that if you remove the honeysuckle from the hazelwood, they will both die. Lovers either cannot be together, or they are persistently reminded of the love that they are not supposed to consummate. And then by the tragic circumstances of their death, either through murder or that deceit of Iseult the White by keeping them.
Adultery is such a serious offense, especially if it's adultery with the wife of your lord.
Yes.
It's such a serious offense that the only way you can have a true hero and heroine is if there is some way that the audience can excuse their behavior. And the potion allows that.
Yes. Because this is the problem with Lancelot and Guinevere.
There is no excuse.
There's no excuse. And so you end up with people like Mallory who have to try, in a very convoluted way, exonerate them by saying, we don't know if they were in bed together, but love back then is not like love is nowadays. We don't know. Yeah. But we do know. We know. We absolutely know that they're at it. But with Tristan and Isolde, the plausible deniability comes with the potion, because if they are just victims of circumstance, it's not their fault.
There's nothing they can do about it.
Nothing, and there's no way to fight that potion.
It doesn't undermine their nobility.
Yeah.
The love potion may excuse their adulterous passion, and the mid-13th century prose Tristan adds to that by making Mark into a terrible person and an unworthy husband for the noble Iseult. But regardless of the justifications for their adultery, Tristan and Iseult pay for their love with their lives. Lancelot and Guinevere both survive, but end their days apart. Their adultery does not lead to their deaths, but it is the catalyst for the destruction of the Fellowship of the Round Table. Neither the Lancelot and Guinevere nor the Tristan and Iseult tales really celebrate adulterous love. The ultimate lesson to a courtly audience of household knights and ladies of the court is that adultery, no matter how noble the knight or beautiful the lady, can only end in tragedy, even if the Tristan wannabe doesn't end his days suspended by his feet with his head in a latrine. So, we have come to the end of yet another episode. I know that we haven't talked about how the story of Tristan and Iseult has been treated in modern literature and movies, but Kat and I plan to do a separate episode about that. Kat, I just wanted to thank you again for joining me to talk about adultery in medieval literature.
Thank you so much.
I hope you'll join Kat and me for the next episode. And until then, bye for now.